let's give you some background information before we start with this. What I often see in projects is that, in BI projects, so to speak, is that people define requirements on the basis of a report or an analysis they need. So, for instance, the finance manager says, I need an analysis on the cost of goods sold, for instance. Okay, fine. So IT gets to work, finds the sources to come up with the answers, and then presents the data to create reports and create analysis cubes, etc. 3 weeks or 3 months later, somebody else has another idea, and the whole process starts all over again. So what you see is, on a project-based approach, you get a lot of what I call the waiter model. There's not a real counter part, there's not a real discussion with the customer. So what you really need is an information framework that matches your strategy with your information requirements. So that always takes a broader look rather than the project or than the information requirements at hand. So this is the objective of this webinar, to make you aware of what's on when you're thinking in terms of requirements, in terms of information requirements. So let's first look a bit at this webinar's contents. So let's talk a bit about strategy, about formation and formulation, how you build a coherent worldview, how you challenge this worldview, and what the role of BI is in all this. And then, of course, we conclude with what is alignment, BI, and strategic management. If there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them, because the more you ask, the more you will get out of the webinar. I guess this definition is pretty well known by most people. For most people, strategy is a method or a plan chosen to bring about a desired future, such as achievement of a goal or solution to a problem. In the original sense, it was, of course, leading an army. But if we look at strategy today, it's not so, let's say, unidirectional and one-dimensional as it used to be. Today, your competitor can be your partner, your customer can become your competitor, your supplier can become your partner or your competitor. So it's quite diffused today. And strategy is very much about flexible and ever-changing relations in an environment that's also quite changing all the time. Now, if we look at a definition of business intelligence, I'm not going to read the entire definition here. You can do that for yourself, but just give you some background on this. A lot of people try to make the distinction between analytical intelligence and business intelligence. And I think that's a very foolish approach, because these people say that analytics is forward-looking and BI is backward-looking. Now, take for instance the most simple report you can imagine, an Excel sheet with 2 or 3 columns of data next to each other. Well, for some people this is a simple report. For other people this could be a forward-looking statement, because they can add information based on their knowledge, based on their experience to these 2 columns, and draw conclusions that nobody else can draw. So I think it's an academic discussion here. The real essence of business intelligence is simply getting data in a presentable way, publishing the data so you can use it in your organization for all kinds of means. So, as I sum up here, for instance, query and reporting, online analytical processing, statistical analysis, forecasting, and data mining. Let's say that data mining is more of a fancy term for the old statistical analysis, because there also some people try to make the distinction. Well, maybe the only distinction I can come up with is that data mining has more of, let's say, less explanatory power in some cases, because they are looking for spontaneous relationships between data without having a predetermined model, as you have, for instance, in regression analysis and other classical statistical analysis. But hey, this is really on the verge of academic discussions. What works is good, and what doesn't work shouldn't be used. It's as simple as that. Very important, though, is to note that business intelligence can be mission critical, or it can be occasional on a project basis. It can be enterprise-wide or local, let's say constrained to a project, but even then you have to have this enterprise-wide vision. That's important to note. And of course it can be centrally initiated by C-level management or driven simply by user demand. And of course, the fourth, which I wouldn't like to sum up here, often is that BI tries to solve a problem on IT level, which is not, of course, the good entry towards BI heaven. Because most of these IT problems are things like I can't consolidate my data, I can't reconcile the numbers, I have different figures for customers when I launch this query or when I ask this question. So that's not a very nice way to start a business intelligence project. I guess you all heard about one of the most famous baseball players, Yogi Berra, and he's very famous for his quotes, but this quote is a very nice one. A long time ago, when somebody asked him the way to the route to his house, he said, "If you come to a fork in the road, take it," which meant that you could get there either by taking the left or the right direction. And I guess when you talk about strategy, it's like that. Strategy can either be intended or it can be emergent. And let's say that scenario planning has some aspects of the emergent and the intended strategy on both sides. So strategy is about formation, let's say the process of forming a strategic approach, but it's also about formulation. It's about communicating the strategy. Now, you can imagine that in both processes, BI can play a very important role. In the formation process, you have to gather the data to draw conclusions and to come up with a vision. And of course, in the formulation, and then we're talking about self-service BI or mobile BI, you come up with actionable messages for the people involved in the strategy execution. So if you look at the intended strategies, we'll be talking about balanced scorecards and corporate performance management, and of course we'll discuss a bit of the basics of scorecarding. If you look at emergent strategies, yes, there's something like which is called the dark number, maybe things you don't measure yet, things which you are not yet aware of, but which influence the outcome of your strategy. And of course, if you look at emergent strategies, you have to make sure that you have the correct radar and that you pick up the correct signals in the market. And then, of course, on a broader basis, and let's say on a longer term, you have to make scenarios for contingencies. As you probably all know, one of the biggest promoters of scenario planning was Shell. They did so in the 60s when nobody else was doing it. And they made all sorts of scenarios based on the oil prices. They made the most insane scenarios, like oil would become over $100 a barrel, etc., etc. And when they were hit by the first oil crisis in '73, they were the only company that had a response ready for all these scenarios. And they gained market share more rapidly than their competitors in those days. So I guess scenario planning is worth something. Intended strategies is mostly a top-down execution. You have your mission, which explains why you're in the market, why you're there, what's your raison d'être, as the French say. And of course, you formulate a vision and you talk about your core values, what you want to do, how you operate, and why you want to do this. And if people understand this, they will also be able to frame the strategic approach. They will know why you want to achieve the strategy and how you want to do this, and what indicates the performance, if you're reaching your goals or not. So I guess some people think that mission statements and vision statements and all that is very high level blah blah, but if you communicate it well, it will help you enhance the effectiveness of your strategy. And of course you have your building blocks, which are in fact all your assets and your competencies. It's the people, the processes, the infrastructure, the means, the culture, etc., etc. So this is the top-down approach of any intended strategy. And of course, it also follows a certain process. You formulate your mission statement, you imagine the future, talk about it, communicate the future, get feedback on this future statement, and you evaluate the current situation and look at the gap. Then you try to meet the demand you think there is for your product or